Oh God, as we gather in your name again today, what we pray, Lord, is for just your guidance over this next hour and a half or so. What we're always after is a reflected style of learning, which means we want this book that we're reading together to be something that is leveraged by you, so that what's created inside of us is the more of the nature of Christ. And so those things in our life that would either be as obstacles or impediments to that, through the work of your Spirit, we want those things to be removed or adjusted or altered in such a way so that what people see are you inside of us. And that's we're also mindful of just the world events and the things that are going on in our community and in our nation and in the world and just all over the place. What we pray for ultimately is part of what we call the Lord's Prayer, that your kingdom comes, and that where our feet touch somehow reflects your kingdom. Use us in that process, we pray, and we pray in the name of Christ. Amen. Yeah, in anticipation that here in about 20 minutes, y'all will tell me that it's cold. Sorry for those of us that like it kind of cool. We've sort of, it's going to be difficult because of all the doors that are open. So, I mean, you got a lot of humidity. All right, so we are in chapter 7, which is the gaze of the soul. We looked last couple of weeks at chapter 6, which is this idea of a speaking God or a speaking voice. And the premise behind chapter 6 is that God's nature is one to speak, God's nature is one to reveal, and that has happened in very general ways or natural ways that we see throughout creation. At the same time, that has happened in something very specific in what we call the Bible, which is a record of God revealing himself to different peoples at different times. And in chapter 7, it's not that he leaves that concept, but he does leave it a little bit, because he's going to pick it back up in chapter 8. So if you haven't looked at chapter 8, when you go back and just 5 minutes, flip the pages in chapter 6 to reorient yourself, and then go into chapter 8, because 8 seems to go better with 6 than 7. But to some degree, because in chapter 7, what we're going to look at is if God's... did everybody get one of these? That might be helpful. All right, so you got one, Miss Mark. Let's see. Yes, ma'am. And we'll pass these around too. Here we go. Did you get one, Ann? All right, here we go.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So, if God is a speaking God, a God that wants to reveal, and God has done that generally and specifically, chapter 7 looks at the specific aspect of that. What do we process, see, read, understand when we look at the Bible? And what Tozer does in this particular chapter is he makes the assumption that if someone is not a Christian, or at least approaches the Bible without any preconceived understandings, then what would they logically conclude? And I think there are 10 little statements that he comes up with in this chapter, and we'll kind of go through these as much as time permits, about what does someone at least conclude if they at least try to suspend belief or any preconceived notions or theologies or whatever, and just approach the Bible, read the Bible for what it is, and see what we get out of that. Which is the task of everybody that reads the Bible, even if you're an insider. What I mean by insider, the Bible is an insider's book. It's written to Christians. Every single book in the Bible has a original audience, and those audience were in some form or fashion connected to God. So, I mean, the Bible it's an insider's book. It's written to people who either already have faith or are already following God. Either it's a record of their interactions and experience, or it's writing to a community, particularly in the New Testament, where they've got particular issues, and you've got one leader or Christian writing to another Christian or writing to a group of Christians about something very specific. So it's an insider's book. But if we were someone gave you a Bible and you have no preconceived notions, and you pick it up and you read it, Tozer, I think, in this chapter gives you an idea of some level of what you might find. And so we're going to look at that specifically. So the first thing that he talks about in the very beginning of the chapter is that what a person, upon reading the Bible without any preconceived notions, beliefs, or prejudices, what they will at least see is that the Bible, again, this is Tozer's thoughts, the Bible has certain truths which lead us to form certain spiritual principles. That's his language, all right? And so that upon reading the Bible, what we would at least conclude is that it contains some level of certain truths that help us form then certain spiritual principles or guidelines or theologies out of that. He calls that biblical creeds, but we don't really know what biblical creeds are. We know what creeds are, but most that's not a term that is used often in church history. So maybe a better understanding would be the tenets of the Bible, certain theologies of the Bible. What we don't get from Tozer is what those creeds are. So if you had to guess, what would be your answer, or some of your answers, if just at 1,000-meter view, reading the Bible or what you know of the Bible, both Old Testament or New Testament, doesn't matter. What do you think some of those larger spiritual principles that we conclude when we read the Bible? Faith and love, right? So definitely faith. Again, Marilyn, you're always ahead of the game. So let all of us catch up to you. We are going to talk about faith specifically, so don't include faith in your list, all right? We got love. What else do we? All right, so not snippets as in actual Bible verses. What are, if Luke came up to you and said, Mom, the truth is I've never read the Bible. I know we've been a part of church our whole lives, but I've just been faking it. What am I going to get when I read the Bible? What are those big, what large concepts would we draw out of the Bible? History, all right. Guidance, all right. What does it say about God? God is what? All right, so let's start there. Maybe that's about it. Yeah. All right, so yeah, God. What does the Bible tell us about God? Love, Creator, Trinitarian. Yep. So what do we? It also says something about humanity, right? Humans are creatures. What else? Sinful. Yeah, those are what Tozer's getting at. My interpretation when he talks about tenets of the Bible or spiritual principles. There might be specific verses or multiple verses that would lead us to draw these levels of conclusions. But at least when we read both Old Testament and New Testament, we can draw some broad assumptions that we would call truths, which then would lead us to form broad theologies. Does that make sense? All right. Is that what happens when we read the Bible? Help me. Is that right or wrong? Because he doesn't answer. So, if it's not, we can find the right answer. So all-powerful, loving, gracious, forgiving, Trinitarian understanding, Creator, all the omnis, omniscience, I mean, all those things would be biblical creeds or some level of what we understand about God from a very specific revelation, right? And that's a record of how God has, what the Bible is too, is a record of how God has revealed Himself to people at different times and at different places. And what we conclude when we read that are those big ticket items. God is loving, caring, gracious, forgiving, creator, all the things that y'all have listed. Tozer doesn't give us what those things are, so if we had to fill in the blank, I think we've done a pretty good job filling in the blank. And there's also other things we know. We know about humanity. There are some other things that we also conclude when we read the Bible. But the two big topics that the Bible talks about are either God or humanity. Right? I mean, those are going to be the subjects of pretty much every single book in some form or fashion. And, we've got humans created in the image of God, call that the Imago Dei, at the same time sinful and what have you. So we get an idea about what it's like to be humans, also get an understanding, at least these big ticket understandings of who God is and what God does. Again, Tozer says we're not approaching the Bible with anything other than just to read it for what it says. We're going to draw out some spiritual principles that are based on certain truths that he calls biblical creeds. He doesn't answer it, so we filled in the blank of what we think we might be. But because there is also something else that shows up in the Bible, which is this whole concept of faith. If God is forgiving and loving and kind and creator, and if humans are created in the image of God and yet at the same time sinful, then we also, another one of those big ticket items would be something along the lines of salvation or restoration, wholeness, things like that. Faith then is the subject matter of how that all happens or takes place. Tozer does mention that one specifically. He actually says one of those truths that that we get from the Bible, spiritual principle, part of this biblical creed, is the whole concept of faith. And so the rest of chapter 7 has to deal with this idea of faith. What does that mean to some degree? So number 2, if we're making a list, and one has to do with the Bible has certain truths that lead us to certain spiritual principles. Number 2 would be one of those truths or spiritual principles is the whole doctrine of faith. And now, again, Tozer does not go into great language of what he means by the doctrine of faith. One of the things he says about faith is that if you read the Bible without any preconceived notion, at least there is this idea that faith is all important to the life of the soul. Faith is vital. It's indispensable in this whole concept of the pursuit of God. And he says most people, when they read the Bible and when they start talking about faith, there's normally 2 questions that show up. One is, what is faith? How do you define it? And then 2, do I have it? And if I do, what does that look like? And I would agree with that. I mean, particularly the second question would be, of all importance for those who are insiders. Number 2 would be this idea of that one of those truths is what we call the doctrine of faith. Now he goes on, this would be number 3, is that Scripture, according to Tozer, does not define faith. So if someone came up to you after this lesson and said, what is faith? How do you answer it?
But there is faith because of the men in the Bible and even the women that believe God helps them.
Sure. So, we're not saying that faith doesn't exist. We're agreeing that there is faith. How do you define that?
Well, it says not in operation. Wait.
Yeah.
The statement of faith is in operation
Right. So he doesn't. So Tozer would, to quote Jenny, Tozer says one of the conclusions that you have when you read the Bible is that it doesn't and it doesn't define faith as in its definition or its essence. It just talks about faith in its function or its operation. There's not many definitions in the New Testament or Old Testament that says faith is. The only one that you get close to that is Hebrews chapter 11, right? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. But again, that it really doesn't define. It just tells you what happens when you have it or when you exercise it.
It just says like faith isn't tangible.
Right. The Bible assumes faith. Now, the Greek word for that is called pistis. Where's my stuff? All right. So pistis is the word, and pistis, if you did a word study on the Greek word pistis, what you're going to discover is that it has some level of cognitive functioning, mind, what you think, things of that nature, and it has some level of behavioral action in the New Testament. That it encompasses a full person's activity, but it doesn't spend a lot of time defining, as if to say, faith is, and then give you an idea of what it is in essence and in function and what have you. It just assumes that people believe, right? But then you ask the question, what is believing? Well, is that because you can cognitive think, and you have a worldview or an image that there is a God who is like all these things that we said, God is, and then fill in the blank. Is that what believing is? Because in the church's history, the definition of pistis, or how the church has interpreted the understanding of faith, seems to go back and forth throughout time. There are times in the church's history where faith has meant more a cognitive understanding that there is a God. All right? In your mind, you have an understanding that there is a God. There are other times in the church's history where it's not so much on the cognitive understanding as much as it is on the behavioral practice. Faith is what you do, not so much what you think. All right? And so, but inside the Bible, particularly the New Testament, faith is both. It's what you think and what you do. But to Tozer's credit, I think he makes a pretty good assumption about when you're reading the Scriptures, it doesn't define the word in its essence as much as it defines it in its function. Which leads us then to the back part of your page, which are the front part. The front part should be the 1 through 10. Probably should have numbered that, right? The back part, it's funny. On our staff, we're going to do these. Next year, we're hoping to do these it's not like personality tests like Myers-Briggs or something as much as it is some larger looking of how people operate, think, and with our staff. But we already know what some of the answers are going to be. All right, so there's a couple of folks on our staff that the fact that I did not number these pages, they would have picked up on that right off the bat. They operate perfectly in a well-defined structure, and it's analytical. It's got to be very structured. Their day is that way. And then you got someone like me, who is, structure would be like 2% of, what, it's just sort of esoteric out here in no man's land is sort of where that's kind of where I'm at. And a certain person came into my office and gave me a copy of this study that we're hoping to do that they've been researching. And they said, this would be an example of one of our staff members. They took this in a different job, and so they showed me their results. And I was like, oh, this is just like you too, I mean, and the staff member goes, oh yeah, and see how wonderful that is, structure and all this analytical, whatever. And I said, I would be the exact opposite. I mean, all these, this would be like a 2%, 5%, but way over here out in right field, I'd be like 80%, 90%. And he goes, the person, as he was walking out of my office, said, and so we know. And so I was like, yeah, I'm glad, we know it, all right, so it's all good. But the fact, sorry about the segue, I just wasted about 5 minutes of your life. But they would immediately have said, you don't have any page numbers, which ones, where do we start, so they keep me on task because y'all are aware, it's kind of stream of conscious sometimes. So Tozer does, and he's dealing with faith, particularly when it comes to defining it to some form or fashion. He references a passage. One of them is Numbers chapter 21, verses 4 through 9, which is one of the most obscure passages in all of the Old Testament. I'm sure this pops into your mind if I say, what is your favorite Old Testament passage? You're going to think about this time when the children of Israel were walking around in the desert and they were getting bitten by snakes and they were all dying, and they go and complain to Moses, and Moses goes up and complains to God, and God says, well, just form this little thing that looks like a snake, hold it up. When they gaze at it, even though they're bitten by the snake, they're not going to die, and everything's going to be okay, right? Y'all go to sleep thinking about that, right? So what's that? Yeah, well, so if you go to pharmaceuticals, that gives you an idea, why that's their symbol, so got a little history there.
Some religions actually will take snakes, and if they have faith, if the snake bites them, that proves they have faith.
Yeah, I would tell you that. Yeah, so that there are some religions who do that. I would extremely caution anybody there. I've been to those churches, okay? So I've seen that before, and I haven't witnessed someone being bitten and then dying, but I have heard of plenty of cases where, said minister was going to illustrate that this, he had faith and he got bitten by a snake, and evidently he didn't, and so they're part of Mark's gospel. This is where they get this from, right? So just so that you know, part of Mark's gospel, and this is the first time you've heard this, just put a pin in it. I'm not trying to do anything to distract you, but go home and look at it, all right? So part of Mark's gospel that was added to the original ending, all right? What I mean by that, when you read Mark's gospel, you're going to get to a part where it talks about, and Jesus rose from the dead. Mark's gospel ends, all right? And you have a footnote that says, original Greek manuscript A ends here. 400 years later, it's not quite that long, but a number of years later, there's another part that was now added to Mark's gospel, which means it was around, okay? All right? And it's going to talk about how, you can hold snakes and not die and stuff like that. So I'll show it to you. Some of y'all got it.
No, I want to say something just about reading it.
All right, go ahead.
This morning I had a devotional that I read, and it had that snake part in it.
Yep.
It also had the loaves and the fish that I'm talking about. But I think it's uncanny that that's in this that I read too.
Right.
What do you mean what she said?
She was just saying that she was reading the devotional and it talked about snakes, and at the same time it had a reference to loaves and fish. Is that right? Yeah.
But it was like the same thing.
Right.
That's bizarre to me.
Well, perhaps I.
It was about snakes too.
Yeah. So, did I write it? No, I'm just kidding. So, all right, here's an example, right? So, the earliest Gospels that we have of Mark end at verse 8. 16. Mark chapter 16. See, in some Bible, this is the NIV. So if you like the NIV, this is a perfect example of that. You probably have something that looks just like this. Or if you don't, you're going to have a footnote that says, down here, down at the bottom, some manuscripts in, between verse 8 and verse 9. A later manuscript, now when I mean later, I don't mean like Middle Ages later, okay? This is all would be within about 100 years, okay? There are Gospels that have this part in it as well. And so you're still looking at, Mark's Gospel, we believe, was written first. It's what we call Markan priority. And the reason why is because it's the shortest. Most of the time, the shortest is the first one. And the fact that Matthew and Luke quote Mark, and then they have their own pieces that they're bringing in as well. So that's all part of what they call Markan priority. But there is a portion of Mark's Gospel, which is this part right here, that is not in the earliest manuscripts, all right? But I don't want you to get hung up on as if to say, gosh, this was written around 64. The earliest one was written around 64. The later ones were like 90, all right? So it's not like it's 500 years later and you've got something that looks completely different. But to the portion that people have witnessed, there is a part in here about snakes somewhere. Hang on. Oh, here it is, verse 18. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison. All right, so I'm not advocating y'all do any of that. And yeah, okay, well, good. I'm glad. So so we're going to assume what the Bible assumes, and that is that people, even though that faith isn't defined in its essence, it is defined in its function. And we're going to be like Tozer and assume that people who follow God have faith, whether or not they're picking up snakes or not. If you want to try it, go right ahead. All right, I'm not advocating you do that. I tend to operate on the assumption that every snake is good when it's dead, whether it's poisonous or not. And so I have no problem shooting any snake. Did I tell you about my rattlesnake story? Yeah. So that was interesting. All right. So let's get back to the lesson before I just waste more of your time. All right. So scriptures do not. Number 3, Scripture doesn't define faith in the way that we would like, but it is defined functionally. The Bible does assume faith, and it shows the results of that. And Tozer would say because there is no essence definition, we can think of faith in terms of, and this is a key thing for him, of what is experienced with an action. All right? And that's where the whole Numbers 21 comes in, where he quotes Moses 21. He quotes Moses chapter 21. He quotes Numbers chapter 21, where Moses has this issue. Here's the text. It's on the back of your page, or the front of your page, and how there's a remedy, and the remedy is where Moses fashions a snake out of a pole, lifts it up, people gaze upon. Now this is where we get to the title of the chapter, the gaze of the soul. They gaze upon the pole, what's lifted up, and that becomes a remedy for them, or some level used in healing. So he's going to stick with that, because in a few moments Tozer is going to draw upon what Jesus said in John chapter 3, which is why you have that passage on the back of your sheet. You probably don't. Where are the extra sheets? No, I need an extra one up here. Because Jesus actually quotes this in the bold print of John chapter 3. Now, most of us, if not all, are very familiar with John chapter 3, because that's where we get verse 16. But the context of that is Jesus is talking to a religious leader, Nicodemus. They're asking questions about salvation, about eternity, kingdom of God, things of that nature. Verse 9, Jesus says, well, you got to be born again. That takes place in verse 6 or whatever, 3. And then Nicodemus has questions about that. How can a person be born again? Can they go back into their mother's womb and be born a second time? And Jesus sort of pushes him for not knowing this thing. If I told you here, verse 12, if I've told you earthly things and you do not believe, how are you going to understand spiritual things, heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except he who has descended from heaven, the Son of Man. Then we get to verse 14, which is a reference back to Numbers 21. All right? You with me? That's really not in the text. I'm filling in the blanks. That's not in the chapter. I'm filling in the blanks of what Tozer is doing. And Jesus, talking to Nicodemus, said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, this is the only time in the Old Testament that Moses lifted up a serpent. All right? So it is, you cannot, no one can say, well, what about this passage or what about that passage? It is Numbers chapter 21. So must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Now what Tozer does, and this is an interesting thing here, and good on Tozer, again, he's talking about faith functionally, operationally, and making this comparison about people in the Old Testament looking at the serpent or on the pole. At the same time, Jesus quotes looking at who's going to be raised up. In this case, Jesus is referring to himself. He's going to make the connection then that faith or believing has something to do with seeing, gazing. All right? So the majority of chapter 7, Tozer would probably use as synonyms this idea of faith, believing, seeing, or gazing. Something that has to do with sight. And so the rest of what we're going to talk about is this whole concept of believing, seeing, drawing upon what Tozer is doing. As people gazed on the lifted serpent, they were saved. As people gaze upon Jesus, they are saved. So 4, if you're filling in the blanks on number 4, is that Jesus is telling people, and John chapter 3 would have been an example of this, that salvation is from believing in Him. That's what he says in chapter 3 of John, as the one lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. All right, does that make sense? Okay.
Would you say it one more time?
All right, that Jesus in the New Testament, you know what? I probably should have just wrote those down. That'd have probably been really smart. See my brain over here just doesn't operate that way. Jesus in the New Testament tells people that salvation is from believing in Him as the one who was lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. And the connection for Tozer is as people gazed at the serpent in the wilderness, and as people gaze at Jesus, who is now lifted up, the same thing is going to take place. Healing, salvation, wholeness.
In some place, I don't think it's here, I think Jesus says something about being lifted up. Is that, I've heard or read or something about that being a reference actually to be lifted on the cross?
It is. All right, yeah. So lifted up.
This is not?
Yeah, no, it is. It is. So,
Okay.
so the question is, what does Jesus mean when He talks about being lifted up? The lifted up part would be on the cross. But the connection is back to Numbers chapter 21. The serpent was lifted up, and people who gazed at the statue or the serpent on the pole, that was a means of healing. Jesus would say, on the cross is His lifted. That's Jesus being lifted up, and so He's making the analogy that He is. This is Shane's term from Numbers chapter 21. Because as soon as I say this, I'm going to have some wonderful looks. Jesus is the serpent. All right? We hear serpent. We go back to Genesis chapter 3 and go, oh no, this is not good. Just stay in Numbers chapter 21. All right? We're not going to Genesis 3. We're just in 21. All right? So, does that make sense? Hopefully it does. All right, good. So, but the idea, the connection is Jesus is Jesus is the New Testament version of Numbers chapter 21. How about that? Does that feel better than saying a serpent? Yeah, okay, good. I can live with that too. All right. So, number 5 then is by this connection that he's making with Numbers 21 and John chapter 3, looking or gazing and believing are the same. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. Again, I'm sure my book is off, as Sally's not here. Sally, if you're watching, feel free to text me what the actual page number is, because I do not know. For me, in my old book that is out of print, it is page 81. Now, I think that means it's going to be 72 for you.
And what are we looking for?
Hang on, I haven't read it yet. So this is what. All right. So this is what he says. My page 81. I think it's your page 72. It's a quote. And he, or you could put she there, would understand that while Israel looked with their external eyes, believing is done with the heart. I think he, you could also say she, would conclude that faith is the gaze of a soul upon a saving God. Top of page 73. So it's top of page 71 in some people's books. It is top of page 73 in another. Or it could be page 81. 71, 73, 81. All right. That's like roulette numbers, right? 71, 70, so. All right. Anyways, all right. So maybe we should play Tozer's numbers the next time what is it? What do they get? Yeah, when the lottery gets like $1 billion. Tozer visited me and said I need to play these numbers. All right. So looking or gazing, either word is fine, and believing are the same. My page 82, which means it's going to be your page early 70s. From all this, we learn that faith is not a one-done act, but a continuous gaze of the heart at the triune God. Y'all see that? 73. What you got, Becky? 72, 73, or 82. Any of those would be fine. B, 82. All right, so, but you got this idea of where it's looking. Sorry. I told y'all, in this building project, we have a meeting that's just before the sun comes up on Tuesday. And so in order for me to make this meeting, I have to do a lot of stuff that I normally do in the mornings so that so my day's like I want it to be. And so by the time I get here now, I'm like 10 cups of coffee in. And so breakfast is worn off, so you're straight caffeine. She asked, would a new book help me? The only problem is I have all these notes where, it's just like goes on forever. And that's why I have one of my Bibles, it's all the pages are falling out. But I cannot get rid of it. One, because it has a fair amount of, I could be buried with this Bible and I'd be happy with it, right? And yeah, but I've lost so many pages, it'd almost be it'd be a holy Bible, so, it is what it is. Partly too, because I got 1,000 notes, and I just, anyways, I probably need to do that. All right, so believing and looking or gazing, same thing. But what he does, and that's number 5, so 5B might be gazing is a process. Because he spends some time here. And I think this is important for us because if he's talking about believing, faith, gazing, seeing, how they're all kind of connected together, and how it's a process, that is very good for us to constantly be aware of. That obviously it starts someplace, so there is an initial act, but to take on the full definition of the Greek word belief or pistis, and it can be either used as a noun or as a verb, it encompasses both mental or cognitive and behavioral or functional understanding of a person and life. That there is an initial aspect of that, but it is a continual process of thinking and behaving or believing or walking, whatever it may be that you want to use to describe that. I think all those would be accurate. In the beginning, to Tozer's credit, he talks about at first it's difficult or it's more difficult. But then the more you do it, the easier it becomes. Distractions may hinder for a bit, but once a heart is committed to Him, that is God, distractions aren't as difficult. I have found that to be true. I hope you have as well. So I think Tozer is really on the money here in this part of the chapter where he's describing faith, this idea of gazing, seeing, and it's a continual aspect of life. Worldview, maybe that's a good modern word, that you have a worldview where in your worldview is this understanding of God is, humanity is, God does certain things, and so you live, you operate, you function as that, as a reality in your life. So number 5, looking and believing to some level are the same synonyms. Also on my page 82, which is going to be 70 something for y'all, this whole idea of looking and believing, he actually takes the physical eye, and I think this is a great little part in the chapter. He talks about the eye. The eye does not see itself. It can't. The eye sees what's in front of the eye, right? So when you're looking, unless you have a mirror, I mean, you can't see yourself, right? You see me, right? And I see you. So the eye sees never itself, but what's in front of it. And he draws on this idea that faith is occupied with the object that it gazes upon, that it seeks to continually see, and it rests in that object, not in itself. All right, so just think about that. That is actually really, really good. If there's one thing that you draw out of this chapter, find that. Do y'all know what page it is? Yeah, so faith is the least self-regarding of virtue. 74, 73, somewhere in that neighborhood. 72. But that is helpful, okay? So, for this reason, now he does not spend any time on this, but I think it's worth us spending 2 minutes before we take a break on this. When we do have distractions, and distractions can be external circumstances. Distractions sometimes can be internal. Now he does talk about this. He talks about where someone struggles to purify themselves. I'm going to use some different language. When people feel guilty or feel shameful from repeated failures, internal. Sometimes the difficulties are externals. Maybe you go through this past Sunday, if you were in church Sunday. If not, go back, listen to the sermon. We talked about an external circumstance that makes it harder to see sometimes, harder to believe. That is death, particularly death of a loved one. Grief can be that way. Gazing upon the object continually helps us deal with that. All right? For instance, I remember the first time I went to the Met in New York. It was a number of years ago. And there were these paintings that I wanted to see. I studied, my journey through college kind of hit on all kinds of disciplines. For a couple of years, for a year, I studied art. Why? I don't know. Easy A. All right, so there were all these paintings, that I saw in books and whatnot, but I wanted to see the real deal. And I had a field day my family hated that because I was like, we got to go to this one. And they're just like, come on, can we leave? And, but I just wanted to see that and see this. It's not like I paint or anything like that. But I just wanted to, it was just beautiful to me. And literally sat there for, all day on about 5 or 6 different paintings. And just to be in awe of that. So sometimes you see that, or sometimes you might, so you can see people who gaze upon something that in their mind is of great value and of great beauty, and they're fixated on it. And it's not that they lose track of time or the circumstances that are going on. Those circumstances are what they are. They do not change. It's just there's something about gazing at it that becomes a level of hope or strength or peace. If you go back, I was also a history major. If you go back and read the early accounts of, this is hundreds of years ago, people coming into the United States when they saw the Statue of Liberty. All right, and you go back and read. I mean, seriously, go back, Google it up. You can find it. Or next time you're in New York, go out to Ellis Island and take it. They still have them. All right, read or listen to those accounts of really what it was to see the Statue of Liberty as the ship approached. And it wasn't. I mean, it's just metal, right? I mean, but there's something about gazing upon that was bigger than their circumstances. All right. The easiest one is to go watch a parent right after a child is born. And the child, I mean, it's one of the greatest things in my job, by the way. So it is what it is. I'll take it. Work 30 minutes a week, and I get to look at people holding babies. So, but you can see a mom or a dad hold that child. And again, the outside circumstances have not changed. The world still is what it is. Their life still is what it is, okay? Even some of the internal circumstances have not changed. The fact they just hold the baby and they gaze at the baby and it's right with the world, right? Okay, same concept. That this idea of gazing upon God, and he used the analogy of an eye. I picked up some other analogies. That regardless of if it's external or internal, and because it's a continuous gaze, you just stay fixed on the object. All right? And what you'll discover is that in your gaze, or in your sight, or in your belief, or in your faith, they're all words that show up in the chapter for the same thing, that you'll find a source of strength that comes from that. All right? Right. So when the eyes of the soul look out, the eyes of God look back. We're actually going to get to that very specifically in some of the numbers after our break. But so pencil that for just a moment, because that's going to be our segue back into how faith, sight, believing, or gaze actually becomes a source of strength. All right. So let's take how about maybe 7-10 minutes, or 5 to 7 minutes, which is really going to be more like 10 minutes. That would be fine. All right. Just to kind of, well, we might have one or two that are still out. Let me just pull up something real quick. Look on. We will meet next week on the 14th, but we will not meet the week of Thanksgiving. It's not the 14th, the 13th. Yeah, we'll meet on the 13th, and that'll be next week. But we will not meet the 20th, which is actually good. I mean, that's the week of Thanksgiving, but we also don't have any heating or air that day. Yeah, so you're more than welcome to come up. Yeah, this is, they're having to do some stuff with boiler and HVAC, so we actually won't have any heating or air the 20th at all. We'll have power, just not heating and air. And just in case you're wondering, while we're waiting for one or two more, our last Wednesday night supper will be December the 5th. That's children's musical that night. This coming Wednesday night, we're doing the Hurricane Buckets. On the 14th, we have another installment of the St. Paul Newlywed Game. So if you actually want a pretty good laugh, you can come that night. And then we're off on the 21st because that's the day before Thanksgiving. On the 28th, we'll have a Ukraine update. And then on the 5th, we have children's choir musical. And then we break. And the reason why is because we should be finished with the forum hallway by then, with the HVAC side. So the next zone to go down is above the kitchen, and that requires a ton of work. And it's going to be down from December the 5th to about the end of January. And yeah, so if Beauty makes dressing for you for Thanksgiving, go ahead and get that order in, or even Christmas or whatever, I guess. Yeah, the issue is you have to take the whole ceiling down in the kitchen. And we lose some time because of Christmas and New Year's and subs being on our property, and it's just requires a fair amount of work. So we'll be down for a part of. I turned it down at break, so it'd be cooler when we came back in. But now we'll adjust. We still, I mean, like the prime timers and things like that, they'll still meet. We just won't have access to the kitchen. So can't do Wednesday night supper. But some of the special groups that meet that don't require feeding a ton of individuals, we can cater that in. And there's some outside groups that use our church around Christmas and our fellowship hall, and we still going to honor those. But just our Wednesday night supper schedule will end on December the 5th, but then we won't start back probably till February. All right? So, just trucking along. All right, any comments so far before we jump back in? All right, so we're at this idea of faith, viewing, eye, gazing, object is what we focus on, not on ourselves. Because Tozer would say one of the things that's been a struggle that affects our vision is the effects of sin. So when we get to number 6, and Ann brought this up, what happens, how is it that gazing upon this object becomes a source of peace or help or aid or what have you? How is it? What takes place? And Ann helped us out before the break where it talked about how when we gaze upon God as our object, that's what we're looking at, our faith, our belief, God gazes back. And to use language that is not in the chapter, but what we would probably be more comfortable with, definitely see this in the New Testament, that would involve what we call the role of the Holy Spirit, how God interacts with people. So number 6 would be, if you want to ask the question, why is gazing so helpful? When we gaze at God, God gazes back at us. So the question then that Tozer poses in the chapter is, are there limitations to that process? The idea of gazing to God, and particularly God gazing back. Are there limits to God gazing back to a person? Now, that would be number 7. Are there any limitations to this gazing? And the answer is no. Now, he elaborates on that. He talks about how if you see faith as this gazing or seeing analogy, then it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. Just gazing upon God, being fixated on God, and that becomes part of just your life, your thought, your actions, everything that makes you, just a part of who you are and what you're about, and how you process. Tozer says, one of the reasons why there's not limitations to this is, one, it's very simple. You don't need any extra things to see. It's not like you need a magnifying glass, need glasses or anything like that, or a telescope or whatever. You have enough. The heart's eyes, to use Ephesians language, is enough. Not only that, Tozer said there's no limitations because it's not time related. As if to say you can only gaze on every odd hour and every even hour. You can't. I mean, you can only gaze in the morning and not at night. It's as long as you have the ability to see. Again, talking about your heart, not your eyes. Then that's all that's required, and that is outside of time, as in a time commitment or duration. Tozer goes on to say it's not limited to restriction, which means you can do it anytime or any place. It's not limited to a person, which means that you don't have to be a clergy, or you don't have to have X amount of years in a church, or have this walk of life or that walk of life. It is open to all people. The idea is that upon gazing at God, God gazes back at us. And the number 7 would be, is there anything that would limit that? And the answer is no. No. There's nothing outside of us that will limit that. Now, on number 8, this is my numbering, he does talk about disciplines, because it would seem like if all it is just gazing, what about all this other stuff that we do inside the church or what have you? So some of you who y'all filled out the form, which is very helpful for us. We're in our little season of consecration. Some of that has to do with financial planning. Some of it has to do with planning around different ministries and what have you here at St. Paul. And so we ask people to consider ways that they might serve, what have you. So if it's just gazing, then why we even do all this other stuff? And Tozer would answer the whole concept of disciplines, which would be number 8. What about disciplines? He writes this. I have no idea what page it's on because I did not write that down. I would assume it is on page 87 for me, so we'll probably be 80, 79, 80, 81 for you guys, somewhere in the neighborhood. But it's this paragraph. I do not want to leave the impression that the ordinary means of grace have no value. 77 and 79. Boy, y'all are like just quick on the. Did you hear that? Just like, I do not 77. I mean, it's just like. All right, so what am I thinking now? You know what I mean? It's just. I do not want to leave the impression that the ordinary means of grace have no value. Now, when we talk about means of grace, often we're talking about either sacraments or we're talking about disciplines. In this case, disciplines. I do not want to leave the impression that the ordinary means of grace have no value. They most assuredly have. Private prayer should be practiced by every Christian. Long periods of Bible meditation will purify our gaze, and directed church attendance will enlarge our outlook and increase our love for others. So he goes through all this service, work, activity. They're all good and should be engaged engaged in by every Christian. But at the bottom, all right, this is the key. But at the bottom of all these things, giving meaning to them, is this idea of a gaze, will be the inward habit of beholding God. So the reason why we practice disciplines, and as a church, we want people to be engaged in different parts of discipline. What you're doing now is a discipline. Okay? Study, reflection, things of that nature. is because that helps the gaze. That strengthens the gaze, the seeing. That, the idea, again, you're gazing upon the object. And the means of grace or disciplines is a tool that you use and God uses. Both y'all use it together to solidify the gaze, Shane's terms. So that's why we do what we do. It's not to monopolize your time or ask you to give resources or whatever it may be. It's what happens when we do that. All right? So why is worship important? Okay? Is because in worship you give of yourself, whether you talk about in terms of reverence, of honor, of adoration, it doesn't matter. Same thing. You're acknowledging what you're looking at. The reason why you study is because that can be used to help what you're looking at. Why you pray, because it helps you to stay on what you're looking at. Okay? Why you give is because it helps you to stay on what you're looking at. They are tools that are used by you and by God to help cultivate the gaze, to use Tozer's language. And so that's why disciplines are important. A new set of eyes will develop within us, enabling us to be looking at God while our outward eyes are seeing the scene of this passing world. The idea that you're fixated upon God, and that becomes the means that helps one transcends whatever circumstance, external or internal, might be in their life. So number 8 would be, why are disciplines important? Well, this is the reason why. They help strengthen and cultivate the gaze, the seeing, the believing, faith. All right. So one of the questions he then, Tozer, addresses near the end of the chapter is, since we're talking about it in first person terms, does that mean we're too individualistic? Which is a good question. And so he gives this what I think is really maybe we'll ask Jenny to chime in on this because of her music background. He says there's if we're only thinking about our own gaze and not how that affects the community or whatever, does that mean that there's no unity or no one accord? Because you hear a lot of that in both Old Testament and New Testament. What about this idea of all of us looking together? And he gives this interesting analogy. He says, if you take 100 pianos and they're being tuned by the same tuning fork, by nature they will be in tune with each other. Because the measure by which they accommodate towards is the same thing. So the more you gaze, even if you're just talking about your own gaze or your own sight, if everybody is doing that, again, it's the object. It's not the eye that's most important. The eye cannot see itself. What the eye sees is the object. So what the gaze is about, the gaze of the soul, to use the title of the chapter, is you're gazing upon an object. If everybody is gazing at the same object, they're going to be in one accord anyways. Because it's the same tuning fork that they're being tuned by. Which is interesting. Which means then we think unity is we all got to be together on everything. That is never true. It's there's this wonderful passage, and someone told me this one time. I've never forgotten it. It's in the Gospels where it says, "Where 2 or 3, are gathered in my name, I'm gonna be in their midst and one accord and stuff like that." You know what else happens when you get 2 or 3 together? When 3 gets there, politics. I'm not going there. She said, especially 3 women. I'm not. You can have it too with guys. And 2, yeah, a lot of agreement. Or what I'm saying, there's nothing hidden. Put 3 people together, always some levels of something going on that might or might not be unity. But if we all have the same, if the object of our gaze is the same, then even though that becomes the unifying piece that holds everybody together. And that's something that we all need to constantly have, because there are things that show up just in our life. Sometimes it's personalities, worship styles. All right, we've talked about this a number of times here. For Christmas, we're having 2 traditional services, and we're going to do a contemporary worship service this time. And but there'll be some that for their Christmas traditions, it has to be one of these, right? But there are some that their traditions involve worship, and it's going to be completely different. It doesn't mean one is better than the other. It is what it is. And we talked about this last week, which I thought was really good. Wayne, I told you about what we talked about in our staff meeting a couple of weeks ago. On the essentials, the object of the gaze, unity. When it's not an essential, but important, but it's just not the essential, liberty. All right? But in all things, charity. And that's love. Grace. And that's something all of us. So take out theology. All right. So let's talk about how important this is. Even if you're not talking about theology or church or belief, whatever it may be, just in your families. All right. So we're talking about just relationships. Okay. If it's an essential item, yeah, everybody's got to be on the same page. All right. But the essentials aren't that many. Okay. If it's not an essential, but it's important, be a little to each their own. As long as it doesn't, as long as it's not violating the essential, liberty. But how we relate to each other, well, we're going to be loving. Which is, all right, so think about what love is. Love is a choice you make regardless of circumstances or response. Someone can be unloving to you, and you still can choose to be loving to them. All right? Love is a choice. It is. It is not esoteric. It's not what Cupid shoots you with, and that's garbage. All right? That's just make believe. It works good on Valentine's. Sells about like $1 zillion worth of stuff. It just doesn't preach, and it's not accurate. Love. All right. So some of you were at a wedding this past weekend. And we talked about the vows, all right? What were they? They were all commitments, choices that they're making. All right? This is what I'm going to do, to have and to hold, and all that. You've heard the language. All right? It's not something, well, if it's convenient, or if it feels good, or if you do it first and then I'll receive. No, that doesn't work either. It's a choice you make on the front end. And which means that it's how you're going to care regardless of what somebody else is going to do. And they might always be unloving, and you can't control that. And you can't change that. Okay? But you can choose to say, well, I'm not going to treat you the same way. Again, it's not the same as reconciliation if the relationship's broken. We've talked on that plenty of times. But you can decide ahead of time that how you want to respond to them, even if they don't reciprocate. And sometimes they never will. Some people will burn it down just to watch it burn. Okay? That's the way some people are in life. It's unfortunate. Okay? But that's just what they'll do. But you don't have to burn it down too. That's the choice you can make. All right? So, on essentials, yeah, we got to all be on the same page. On something that's a non-essential but is important, we're going to grant some liberty to each other. But how we at least will relate to people when there are disagreements or what have you is we're going to treat people lovingly. That is actually the nuts and bolts of the New Testament. How do you treat another person? Same way you want to be treated. How do you love another person? The same way that God. How you treat yourself and how you relate to God become the filter for how you relate to another person. It's a golden rule. And when Jesus asked to simplify it to the easiest thing in the world, well, this is it. So the way you love yourself, care for yourself, yeah, you want to treat people on the same level. That's not, if gazing at the object, that is possible. All right? If you lose your gaze, it's darn near impossible. Because there's what sits inside of humanity and inside of all of us, is, if it's not balanced by something that is different, and then that difference would be God, people by nature will act out. And you don't need me to tell you that. You've probably already seen it, witnessed it. If you live long enough, you definitely will. All right, so number 9, is it too individualistic? Absolutely not. Last one, number 10, and then we're going to stop. As we gaze toward God, it's number 10. As we gaze towards God, God gazes back to us. All right, we've already talked about that. This is the last little piece for number 10 that's important. And this is Tozer. Tozer would say, and it ushers into a new level of spiritual life. Or practice, or however you want to. But
It's hardly necessary to mention this. I like the way he says that.
what?
He says it's hardly necessary to mention this for only individuals who have made it such.
Right.
Who have made it thus far.
Yeah. So, because again, it's a continued process.
Right.
But the more you gaze upon the object, and the more the object gazes back towards you, eventually that becomes the norm. Right? And so you start to live a life as that is the norm, not something that's new. And the more it becomes the norm, then everything that's a part of that life also becomes the norm in your life. All right, comments, questions? Who was it? David Letterman used to have a top 10 list every night. This is Tozer's top 10 list, right? So number 10. All right, we all good? All right, so we'll meet next Tuesday, but then we won't meet the Tuesday after that, okay? And then we'll break some part in, I think, I'll have to look at the refreshment list, middle of December or something like that. All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.